Shabbos, everyone. Today is Friday, December 27th. It is the 26th of the month of Kislev. Today is the second day of Hanukkah. So tonight we will begin the third day of Hanukkah, lighting 3 candles this evening. So this parashah for this week is called Miketz. It continues the novella that we began last week of Joseph and his amazing technicolor dream coat, Joseph and his brothers, Joseph who becomes Prince of Egypt. And we are always reading this novella when Hanukkah comes around. So the themes of Hanukkah are interwoven into this parashah and vice versa. There are kind of two ways that you can look at Hanukkah. Both are authentic to the tradition. However, well, first off, the two ways are essentially one is focused on the military victory, the Netzach energy. It's the energy of victory. It's the energy of triumph. It's the energy of striving, of fighting, standing up, acting. And the other modality of Hanukkah is about the menorah and the miracle of the oil. And this they say is the energy of Hod. This is the energy of acceptance of what is. Now the word Hod has a connotation of light, of shining, of luminous. So it is a luminous accepting of what is, not a defeatist accepting, but a luminous and illuminated, maybe even enlightened way of accepting what is. The rabbinical tradition, which is to say Judaism, the religion that we have been practicing for the past 2,000 years, really up until the 20th century, emphasized the story of the miracle of the oil and de-emphasized the story of the military victory. So for most of Jewish history of the past 2,000 years, the emphasis has been on Hod energy, luminous, humble acceptance of what is. Not defeatist, but acceptance. Historians will say that the change in the 20th century happened when Israel, the state of Israel, really reclaimed and recentered the military victory story. So there are these two different ways of looking at Hanukkah, and it's important to realize that the military victory is the emphasis that you might have experienced in your lifetimes on that part of the story is, according to historians, a product of the 20th century, of 20th century Jewish history. The primary story that was told was the story of the oil, of the cruise of oil. So the rabbinical tradition de-emphasizes de-emphasizes militarism, violence, accomplishment through violence, and focuses in on the presence of God in the acts of human beings. So according to Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, for example, the miracle of the cruise of oil is not so much that the oil lasted for 8 days. It was actually that the priests, the people in the temple, found one cruse of oil. It was only enough to last for one day, which could have led them to say, okay, never mind, can't do anything right now. We don't have enough oil. Forget it. Let's go about whatever we have to do at this point. And instead, the miracle was they decided to light the menorah anyway. They had no idea. They had no idea. It's a part of the story we might forget. They had no idea it was going to last. They had no idea that some miracle was going to happen. As far as they knew, they were lighting the menorah for one day to rekindle the lights in the sanctuary. So that act of chutzpah, of acceptance, that illuminated and luminous act is what was the emphasis for the rabbis, to the extent that, for example, in a text I was studying this year, or this week actually, one of the greatest commentaries and most influential Jews of our history, there was no discussion at all of the military aspect of the holiday in his teachings about what Hanukkah is. With that in mind, it's very interesting to look at something from this week's parashah and commentary on it. So as I was going through this week's parashah, there was a strange connection between this verse in this week's parashah, and the verse is Vayikra'u simelotam veya'amos ish al chamoro vayashuvu ha'ira. The brothers, they're speaking of the brothers of Joseph, um, discovered that they had inadvertently stolen something from Joseph. They don't, and they rent their clothes. The verse says they ripped their clothes in an expression of devastation, of concern. And then it says each reloaded his pack animal and they returned to the city, went back to return the stolen item to Joseph. One of the connections there in was to the Machzor. In Machzor is the Sidur, the prayer book that we use on Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur. And for no clear reason, the link there says there's a footnote in the Machzor that says that a particular very famous thing that we say on Yom Kippur is based on that verse. So I was puzzled by that because it didn't give me any other information. So I'm taking you on a little bit of a journey here. The verse in question is the one that we call Unetana Tokef. It's one of the most disturbing and poignant passages on the day of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where the Sidur says, V'tichtov et gezar dinam, meaning God, decree, record the decree of their judgment. B'Rosh Hashanah yekatevun, on Rosh Hashanah their decree is inscribed. V'yom tzom kippur yechatemun, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. Kama ya'avrun, how many will pass away? V'kama yibareun, how many will be created? Mi yechyeh u'mi yamut, who will live and who will die? I'm sure you remember this part. And then at the very end of that litany, the Machzor says, Utshuva, utfila, utzdaka, ma'avirin et roa hagzera. Repentance, prayer, and charity annul the evil decree. So when I tried to piece together how this was connected to the verse in Genesis, the only thing I could really come up with is that the verse in Genesis says that the brothers ripped their clothing in a sign of mourning and concern, pain for the fact that they had inadvertently stolen something. Um, and that would connect us to the idea of teshuva, of returning. And then the verse actually ends, vayashuvu, they returned ha'ira, to the city, to go back to Joseph. That's the only connection I could find. But in another verse, actually in, I believe, next week's parashah, Jacob says to Joseph, Vayomer Yisrael et Yosef, Hine anochi met, v'haya Elohim imachem, v'heshiv etachem et eretz avotechem. Then Israel said to Joseph, Jacob says to Joseph, I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your ancestors. Va'ani natati lecha Shechem achad al achecha. Asher lakachti miyad ha'emori bicharbi uvekashti. And now I assign to you, to Joseph, Jacob is giving Joseph one portion more than I am giving to your brothers, namely the portion that I wrested from the Amorites with my sword and my bow, bicharbi uvekashti. So the reference that Jacob is making there is to a military victory, to wresting by violence land from the Amorites. One of the most ancient rabbinical texts we have is a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic by a person named Onkelos. Onkelos writes on this verse. He translates the Aramaic in the following way. He says, Va'ana yahavit lach chulak chad yatir al achach din sevit mida de'emora'a bitzloti uva'uti. What he says is, I have given you one share more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite by my prayer and my plea. Onkelos completely changes the plain meaning of the verse. The words say charbi uvekashti, my sword and my bow. But Onkelos translates it as my prayer and my plea. Now, it's very important to understand that Onkelos is not just translating it, he's recording the tradition of his time as well, the traditional understanding of his time on the verses. So there's that theme of Hanukkah again. There's that theme of moving things out of the realm of military victory on the part of the rabbinical tradition towards a an emphasis on light, an emphasis on light. On this verse, a very famous book of Musar called the Shnei Luchot Habrit, the two tablets of the covenant, writes on this verse that said, literally, of course, he says, Hi milchama kipshuta. He's like, of course, Jacob was literally talking about a military struggle, but v'gam kavshu betfilah. But also, it's talking about how the conquering that Jacob did through tefillah, through prayer. So the Shnei Luchot Habrit says there was another element to this battle, and this is the element that he wants to focus on. The prayer Jacob offered up helped him succeed. That is to say that it wasn't just about a sword and a bow. It was, as Onkelos said, it was about about prayer and entreaty. So the Shnei Luchot Habrit continues. It was Jacob's custom that whenever he was involved in a confrontation, that he would employ three kinds of weapons. Now listen, this is very common in rabbinic literature. And these three weapons might be understood as Jacob's secret weapons. And those are milchama, doron, and tefillah. So milchama, he begins with doron. The weapon called doron was gifts to charity. In other words, tzedakah. In other words, charity. The weapon that Jacob employed called milchama, was the struggle against his own evil urge, his own tendency to the psychological reasons that we cause harm to others. Let's say that's a good definition of sin. Um, so milchama, war in this case, is actually something internal in which you are struggling with your evil inclination. And the weapon called tefillah. So in other words, by the way, I should say that milchama is about teshuvah, right? So we have tzedakah, charity, teshuvah, repentance. It is in this case, it is the act of regretting and seeking to make amends, seeking healing, tikkun, repair for any harm that you did do. So milchama is the struggle to overcome whatever might prevent you from making teshuvah, as well as whatever might incline you towards actions that can be harmful. And lastly, the one of the weapons of Jacob was tefillah, and the Shnei Luchot Habrit says we don't need to interpret that one. We know what that is. That's prayer. But when you look at this, you realize that in this writing by the Shnei Luchot Habrit, milchama, doron, and tefillah correspond to tzedakah, tefillah, teshuva, in the Sidur. Sorry, tshuva, tefillah, utzedakah, repentance, prayer, and charity. So it is these three qualities that the Shnei Luchot Habrit, a work of Musar, a work of ethics, wants to focus on rather than war. He does mention very clearly that war is there. War is there. It's part of the story of Hanukkah. It's part of the story of humankind. But the part that he wants to emphasize is prayer, repentance, and charity. This week I happened to be studying the Tao Te Ching with a TBS member, who I've been studying it with a while. And there's a passage in the Tao Te Ching that feels extremely relevant to what happens if, rather than just, we can favor the light aspect, the menorah story of Hanukkah, but in the background there is this war thing. What happens if you hold them at the same time? What happens if you hold them at the same time? And the Tao says something very clear that you can piece together from various aspects of Judaism, but this says it so clearly that I wanted to share it with you here. So it says a strong military is a tool of misfortune. All things detest it. Therefore, those who possess the Tao avoid it. Honorable gentlemen, while at home, value the left. When deploying the military, value the right. So there's an acknowledgement here that war sometimes happens. If you're going to get involved with war, sometimes when you have to do that, then know the following. The military is a tool of misfortune, not the tool of honorable gentlemen. When using it out of necessity, calm detachment should be above all, victorious, but without glory. Those who glorify are delighting in the killing. Those who delight in killing cannot achieve their ambitions upon the world. Auspicious events favor the left. Inauspicious events favor the right. So the image here is the right hand is usually where the weapon is carried. The left hand represents a softer worldview. Skipping down here, we say that if they are treated as if in a funeral, those who have been killed should be mourned with sadness. Victory in war should be treated as a funeral. If and when fighting is required, What if, what if you brought the consciousness of Tvila Tzedakah, Teshuva Tvila Tzedakah to, to what you have to do? If you brought the concept of acceptance, of humility, of light to the idea that sometimes you have to fight, whether that's militarily or personally, sometimes you have to fight. What if you could actually hold the two stories at once? You want to favor, in our tradition, you want to favor the light. You want to favor the story of the menorah. But when there are times when it is essential and necessary to fight, bring the consciousness in that is still about acceptance. That's not about netzach. It's not about victory and triumph. It's a tragedy to have to fight. It's an awful thing to have to fight. So if you can bring the energy of repair and light into that awful moment when you have to fight, there's a transformative power there that is possible. That's my thought for this week for Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah. Shabbat Shalom.